Good afternoon and welcome to the second lecture for this summer's 2008 Biomedical Research Integrity Series. My name is Malia Fullerton. I'm Assistant Professor of Medical History and Ethics, and I serve as the Director of the BRI program. For those of you who might be new to the series, the BRI program provides an opportunity to explore important questions of ethics and research conduct, to discuss issues with peers and faculty, and to identify skills and resources to help address difficult questions related to research integrity. As part of your larger professional development experience, the BRI program aims to work with you to develop integrity from the inside out as a foundation for a lifetime endeavor. All School of Medicine trainees are required to attend the series lectures and to participate in linked discussion of required topics. If you've not yet registered, please visit the BRI website or contact us at uwbri@u.washington.edu. This year, we ask that you complete your evaluation of lectures and discussion sessions online, and you will be able to find a link for the evaluation for today's lecture on the BRI website from, Margaret tells me, from 1 p.m. today. It will go live. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jonathan Eisen. Is an evolutionary biologist and a professor at the University of California, Davis. His research focuses on mechanisms underlying the origin of novelty, how new processes and functions originate, but most of his work involves the sequencing of the genomes of microorganisms and the development and use of phylogenomic methods to analyze genome data. Dr. Eisen, however, is also a vocal advocate for open access to scientific publications and currently serves as academic editor-in-chief of Public Library of Science Biology. Probably, I think, he could tell us, I believe, the preeminent open access journal. He's also a prominent blogger at his site, The Tree of Life, phylogenomics.blogspot.com, which combines incisive scientific analysis with cogent social commentary. He's here to talk to us today to make his case for describing the merits of publishing in open access journals and to make a case for the widest possible dissemination of emerging biomedical research and other forms of scientific knowledge. This is an important new take on the problem of responsible authorship and publication practice, and one we're excited to initiate a discussion of as part of the BRI series. So the title of his talk today is Responsible Authorship and the Ownership of Scientific Knowledge. Thoughts on open access publishing. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eisen.
I don't know if there's a way to reduce the feedback there, so maybe if I stand over here, there's less of it, or... Okay, thanks for inviting me and bringing me up here. It was a challenge for the organizers to work with my messy schedule, and then I got sick for a while and fortunately was able to still come up. So what I'm going to do is the other microphone on? Okay. That better? Okay. What I'm going to do is basically take you through four little parts, four little stories on this open access adventure that's been my life the last few years. And I'm going to talk about why I am a supporter of open access and some of the ironies behind why I'm now a supporter of open access, as well as the real issues behind it. And then I'm going to tell you more detail about what open access means, the different flavors of open access, and some of the benefits of open access, and then a little bit at the end about the future and the challenges for this open access to scientific publications. So, focusing a little selfishly here at the beginning on my own personal journey towards open access relates directly to this thing called the Public Library of Science. The Public Library of Science was started in 2000 by people you may have heard of, including Harold Varmus, who was the head of the NIH, Nobel laureate, Pat Brown, who helped invent microarrays, and Michael Eisen, my brother. So I heard lots and lots and lots about open access. And it made some sense to me, but I wasn't a complete convert at the beginning. And the first initiative for this group, the Public Library of Science, was to circulate a letter among their colleagues and then on the web and by email to anybody they could find that asked people to sign the letter, basically encouraging publishers to make the scientific literature more freely available. Now I know you can't read this, but this is the letter. It was very simple. And there were some key points in the letter, which was basically encouraging the creation of this online, what they call public library. That's where the Public Library of Science name came from. That would include the full contents, the entire text of the published biomedical life sciences literature. And the people who signed this letter made a pledge that they would do what they could to support this creation of this online public library. And among the things they pledged to do would be to not be involved in non-open access journals and to be involved in the open access ones. That is, to not publish in, nor review for, nor work for the non-open access journals. And that would encourage this shift towards the open access world, or pressure the publishers to shift towards this open access world. About 35,000 people signed the letter, including me. But, you know, my brother started the Public Library of Science. I had to sign the letter. And, you know, it's not that I didn't understand what he was talking about, but I didn't completely get it. And I didn't understand all the issues behind open access. After they published this letter, after they released it and then had, you know, all these signatories, it had some impact. Some publishers of journals said, we are going to shift to a more open access way of life. And existing open access journals like those published by a publisher called Biomed Central got some more support from the scientific community for that journal. But unfortunately, pretty much everybody involved agreed that it did not have the impact they were going for in terms of changing the publishing field. And so what they decided to do, they identified one challenge to open access, which was people complained that there weren't very high-profile journals that were completely open access. And so the Public Library of Science decided to try and create such journals, and they created two journals, PLOS Biology and PLOS Medicine, to try and create very high-profile open access journals in these fields. They got a bunch of money from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation to run PLOS. They recruited editors from Science, Nature, Cell, and other well-known publications to be involved in this initiative. And they started recruiting academic editors to be involved in helping run these journals. And I agreed to be one of the founding academic editors for PLOS Biology. But I still wasn't completely convinced with the whole thing being a black or white issue. My real problem with it was that I didn't understand really the difference between open access publishing and open science, which other people are promoting. That is, and I'll talk about this at the end, open data release and open notebook science and open source software and all these other open things. And the reason I was a little worried about open access publishing was I worked on genome sequencing. And or pressured to release our genome sequence data before we published a paper on it. And we were very worried about this, people accessing the data and publishing papers on our data before we were able to publish those papers. And so at Tiger, where I work, the Institute for Genomic Research, which started the genome sequencing revolution, we created a policy that allowed us to release the data to the web, and that the funding agencies sort of half-heartedly agreed with, which said people can use the data for little things. That's not the wording, but that's what we meant. But they can't publish whole genome analyses of our data until we do. And so people could do a search of the sequence or download the data or even build a microarray based upon the data, but they couldn't publish our genome analysis before we did. And we were quite pleased with this. It protected us, and we still got credit for releasing the data. And I got invited to a meeting in Fort Lauderdale that was a gathering of all the genome sequencing centers organized by Francis Collins at the NHGRI to discuss globally genome sequence data release policies. It was a follow-up of something called the Bermuda Accord, which related to the Human Genome Sequencing Project. And at this meeting, I was surprised about a few things. One of them was that I found out that, in fact, the Human Genome Project, despite the public proclamations of freedom in the human genome data, they actually instituted a similar policy to what we had in releasing the data to the NCBI Trace Archive. So in fact, they were worried about the same things that Tiger was worried about, people scooping them on publishing genome-level analyses, and they created this sort of loophole to protect themselves from that. And I was, at the beginning of the meeting, sort of inclined to say, yeah, that's a really good thing, this restriction, we should keep those restrictions. And then this guy named Sean Eddy, who's a computational biologist, now at HHMI in Genelia Farm, got up and gave a talk where he told us all we were basically ridiculous. And he said, the whole reason you guys got money to sequence these genomes was because of the power of doing genome-level analyses. And if you agreed to release the data for the community, obviously the data should be used for genome-level analyses. That's why you got the money to sequence the genome. And he compared this to open source software, which he was heavily involved in developing. And he said he's releasing all of his software open source even before he publishes papers on it. And he's noticed people occasionally using ideas in his software and writing papers about it. But in the end, he always benefited from releasing his data, his software openly. And he argued that the same would be true with genome data. If we removed that restriction on the use of the data, the genome centers would actually benefit, not be hurt by this release. And I don't know what it was, but my brother had been arguing for years with me about open data release also, and I never bought it. But Sean Eddy convinced me in this 20-minute talk. And so I agreed to do what I think any scientist should do, which is an experiment. I became the first person at Tiger to sequence a genome and release the data with absolutely no restrictions on the use of the data. And this was sequencing the genome of an organism called Tetrahymena thermophila. It's a ciliate, it's a really cool organism. Lots of important findings have come from the study of this organism, like the discovery of telomeres and catalytic RNA and histone acetylation and other such things. And we agreed to release the data with no restrictions to the scientific community to do whatever they wanted with it. And in fact, people did publish papers before we published our paper on genome-level analysis of Tetrahymena. But in the end, we benefited more. We got dozens of collaborators who, instead of writing a paper, offered to help us analyze the genome. And I know you can't see it, but this is a list of the locations of the people that were involved in our paper on the Tetrahymena genome. We had collaborators from about 35 different institutions, most of which came about because we released the data openly. So I started to see the wisdom of this open data release, but I still wasn't convinced about open publishing. And I also decided to do an experiment here. I was involved in PLOS biology, and so I badgered or convinced one of my collaborators that we were going to submit this important new paper to PLOS biology on an organism called Wolbachia. They're obligate intracellular bacteria that in many invertebrates cause detrimental effects specific to males. And in other invertebrates like filarial nematodes, they're mutualistic symbionts. So if you are unfortunate enough to be infected with a filarial nematode, it turns out it looks like you can treat people with those infections with tetracycline. It kills the Wolbachia symbiont inside the worm and helps eliminate the worm from the system. So there's this is a big deal, lots of NIH funding and other funding in working on Wolbachia. And we submitted the paper to PLOS Biology, even though it was being recruited by these other top journals. And so we were doing this experiment, and openness seemed like a great idea, but I still wasn't convinced that it was the only way. And then real life intervened. And I'm going to tell you a very personal story here, so get ready, for why I became a supporter of open access. And it related to my wife and our first pregnancy. So my wife was pregnant right at this time. We were very happy, of course, very excited. And, my wife's not old, but we're not spring chickens. So we decided to have, at the recommendation of our doctors, an amniocentesis performed. We went in for the amniocentesis. Our normal doctor wasn't there. A young let's just be polite, incompetent doctor decided to perform the amniocentesis, and we were so flustered that we went along with it. And he literally botched it. A really bad event. In fact, he did the amniocentesis twice and screwed up both of them. But we just didn't know what we were doing, and we didn't have the legs to say no to all of this. And then we spent a month and a half of hell afterwards, trying to save our baby. In the first few days, my wife had enormous amounts of bleeding. We didn't know what was causing them. We guessed it was the amniocentesis, but we didn't know. The doctors suggested that this was relatively normal. The bleeding got worse. The doctors suggested that this was relatively normal. The doctors also told us they lost the amniocentesis tubes, and so we would never even get the results from the amniocentesis. So we decided to switch doctors. Obviously a little too late. And we decided to take our medical care into our own hands, which is what, of course, lots of other people are doing in the world around us. We had three major issues to deal with, even though our new doctors were phenomenal. What was causing the bleeding? How could we stabilize the situation? And then there was this issue with Rh immunization, with RhoGAM. So I'm a blood type positive. My wife is blood type negative. There was lots of bleeding. They didn't give her a RhoGAM immunization. And now it was, at this point, 6 days later, and so we needed to figure out what to do. So, there are a lot of medical trained people here, you probably know. The supplier and even Wikipedia tell you what to do. You have to get the shot within 72 hours. Wikipedia actually has it pretty good. They even have references, and the supplier did not, to this. So what do you do if we're at day 6? The RhoGAM shot is not without risks. Is it going to be of any use to give the shot at day 6? Our doctors, again, they were really good. They had no idea. So I went to PubMed, and I started looking for papers on Rh immunization and what study actually showed that you're supposed to do it within 72 hours. And so I found a few papers that seemed promising, and I went to the website where I hoped to get them. And I was told I had to pay $29.95 for 24 hours of access to this paper. This is something you guys might not experience. I worked at Tiger. We were a private, non-profit research institute with 300 employees. We did not have subscriptions to much of anything. So you guys click and you get access to that paper if you're within the UW internet address system. But we didn't. And so I had to decide, do I want this paper? I bought most of them. And here's another one, also looked promising. Same type of thing, you need to pay for access to this paper too. Every single time I found a paper that seemed potentially interesting, I had to pay to read it. And of course, I couldn't look at the text before I read it. I had to pay before reading the text. And most of them were not very helpful in the end. So I tried to contact experts, friends, colleagues, email, phone calls, trying to figure out what the literature said about the timing of RhoGAM shots. And some of the other, this wasn't the only thing we were looking into, but that's what I'll tell you about. And I got some emails back from people, very few papers. Most of them wrote back, a month and a half later. That was a little late. And I got some friends to get articles from some libraries. Just as an aside, if you read Lance Armstrong's book, his first book about recovering from cancer, he describes the same thing happening to him. He wanted to read every single article about testicular cancer, and he had to get friends at universities to get the papers for him. So I got really pissed off. We decided to go with the RhoGAM shot after 9 days, having no literature information to back up that decision. The other treatments we also had to deal with basically guessing. And this is a common theme. If you have a weird thing going on, the doctors are going to be looking at the literature too. They're not going to necessarily know. There's lots of information for doctors to know. Even these really good ones that we had didn't know what was said about RhoGAM after 6 days. You have to take your medical care into your own hands somewhat. But unless you're at a university, you can't. You can't get access to this, and that's what's happening to most of the public right now. They are told they have to take their medical care into their own hands, and they can only access Wikipedia. So, and other things. Unfortunately, we lost the fight. So our son was born stillborn a month and a half or so after this whole disaster happened. I don't know if this would have helped. I don't know if any information we could have gotten would have helped prevent, recovery from this originally botched event. But I certainly wasn't happy with what had happened during the course of trying to find this information. So as I said before, here I was, a scientist, trained, willing to look into the literature to help our busy doctors find out what to do, and I couldn't get to the literature. So my conclusion at the time, and still today, was that lack of access is just fundamentally a bad thing. It's bad for this whole personal medicine movement. It's bad for science. Now, I suddenly realized, of course, that my science was also being detrimentally affected by not being able to read any of the literature, but I hadn't really paid attention to that previously. This is against the ideals of the funding agencies, so if you actually look in the charters behind most of the funding agencies, their charter says they're supposed to advance scientific knowledge, the distribution of scientific knowledge. It's against the wishes of the ultimate funders, the taxpayers who pay for us to do this research and then find out that you have to pay again to get access to what they already paid for. And I won't go into this in great detail, but I really believe it is borderline immoral and unethical in this day and age with the internet to publish papers behind closed walls. So now, off of me, and more about, I meant to say, if anybody has any questions anywhere along the way, please shout out. I'm happy to just stop and answer questions about anything. What I'm going to do now is talk to you about open access in general. But that story is why I became an open access advocate. Again, my brother couldn't convince me, and he helped start this whole organization. Individual experience was what converted me and made me realize, in retrospect, I started to understand what Harold Varmus and Pat Brown and all these other societies were talking about when they were talking about the importance of open access. So I haven't really talked about in detail what open access means. And it's very confusing, actually, out there. So there are lots of journals and publishers and societies who talk about openness, and they mean very different things. So you can have a publication that's free in a university archive. You can have something that's free on a journal website after a 6-month delay or after a 1-year delay. You can have it free on a journal website, but you have to register to get access. That's what Science does after a year, I think. It can be free in PubMed Central, so I'll talk about PubMed Central in a minute, this digital archive of publications, say after 6 months. Or it can be free everywhere immediately. That's, for example, what the Public Library of Science and the Biomed Central journals do. And this free part is just a single small part of what open access means. So I've sort of divided into categories here the different parts of openness. So you can have the cost, is what most people initially think of. Is it free? That's what was my main roadblock when I was looking up information for the personal issues. I wanted to get access to stuff, and if I couldn't read it and had to pay $30 for each of 1,000 articles to read them before finding the text I needed, that was untenable. So free availability is important. But the timing of free is also important. When does it come out after the publication is made? Is it immediate or is it later? The location of where it's available is also important. If it's in a journal website that the journal controls, or is it in an open archive that anybody can do anything they want with? I'm going to come back to all of these in a minute. Can you reuse the publication? So is it free but has completely restricted use policies? That is, you can't even use it in a course website, for example, or in a course book? Or is it have unrestricted use, that anybody can use the publication for any purpose? Who gets the copyright to the publication? And who actually carries out the archiving behind the publication? And so, if you're sort of an open access sort of fanatic, you might have heard of this term called green open access. And what green open access really means is this new initiative for authors to archive their own their preprint of their publication that before they submit it to a journal, you can take the text and archive it somewhere. So this is something that would be available in some archive, and the individual is carrying out the archiving, and it's freely available, but in this sort of individual effort. And what I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about is what I really mean by open access, which some people call gold open access. And that is, it's freely available, it's immediately available, it is put in whatever archives are available and can be put in any other archive. It has unrestricted use. That is, it can be used for anything, for any purpose, as long as you cite the original source. The author gets the copyright, and the journal, with its machinery, carries out the archiving. You don't leave it up to individuals. So there's an example of one publisher that does this. That's the Public Library of Science. This is the policy that they adopted for their form of open access. As I said before, they were starting these two journals, PLOS Biology, PLOS Medicine. They've also since then started a few other journals. They originally started what they called community journals, genetics, pathogens, computational biology, and they've also started a few others, and now they've started this thing that's based upon sort of the Web 2.0 movement, where everybody tries to share and label everything, called PLOS One. And PLOS One is this initiative to get the literature out there both faster, so it's peer-reviewed, but they don't ask the reviewers to look at the novelty of what's in the paper, just the technical merit of the paper. And then they have a sort of social networking software that they're still working on that is for annotating, labeling, sharing, and distributing comments on all of these publications. So PLOS has been publishing all of these journals for 4 years or so. There already were open access publishers before PLOS that had the full gold open access policy. So there's one called Biomed Central that actually publishes a few hundred journals now. I think it's a little more than 160. I think this slide is a little old. They're a for-profit company that publishes open access journals to make money. And they make money either off of advertising, or the page charges that they charge people for publishing, and I'll come back to this in a minute, or for other content that they put on some of the journal websites that they charge for that's not the basic literature. All basic science at PubMed, at Biomed Central, is available completely openly. So again, there's this gold open access that I really favor for distributing published literature, and what I want to do is take you through just a little brief bit about each of these different components of this gold open access. So this first component, the one I got really obsessed about originally, and I didn't realize what all these other components were until later, was this free access. And in retrospect, it seems completely ridiculous to me that the literature is not available for free, given that that's what we were paid to do by the taxpayers. But there are lots of other practical reasons to make it available. So I wasn't alone in looking for personal health information on the web. The Pew Foundation estimates that 10 million Americans do this a day. That was a few years ago, right? This is 2006. It's probably more. And in case you don't know, there's a lot of crap on the web about personal health information. Some of the stuff out there is reasonable. Some of it is really bad. And why shouldn't people have the potential to have access to the actual literature that represents the scientific publications that contain the sort of studied information rather than the crackpot stuff that's out there? So if we really want to enable personal involvement in medical care, I see nothing wrong with opening up access to the published literature, given that everybody has access to all the crap at the same time. And I'm not alone in thinking this. The House and Congress and Senate and the British government and funding agencies, they've all basically come to the same conclusion, that it's the taxpayers that are pressuring them, of course, in most cases, but the open access movement made a stroke of genius by calling this taxpayer access, not, open access, when they lobby Congress. And it's true, the taxpayers really, when you tell them that they're paying $18 billion a year or something for the NIH, and the NIH scientists are complaining that that's not enough money, and then you tell them that all of the research that was funded by the NIH, they can't read, you should see the response. This is supported across the board in the right wing, the left wing, the middle, and a lot of the Congress and Senate. And that's why last year they finally passed this NIH open access policy, which is not full open access, but requires all NIH-funded research to be deposited in PubMed Central, the papers to be put in PubMed Central after 6 months. They get that we have to distribute the literature more freely. And this is not a new idea, right? Public libraries exist to provide access to the citizens to information that they might not otherwise have. Right? So this is a quote from 1836, right? The British Museum trying to provide access to scientific or other technical information for students that wanted to pursue it. With the web, obviously, you would not do all of this in a public library physically, but it's really easy to actually do it in a public library virtually. So free access seems to be kind of a no-brainer to me. And you can think of it this way. If we designed a publishing system today, and we didn't have the entire history of our past publishing system, nobody would design it the way it exists now. I mean, it just makes no sense with Google making $18 trillion a year on advertising by providing access to content. Of course you'd say, we're going to provide access to content and then sell ads or something. I mean, it makes no sense to do it the way it currently is being done. So the second component is the speed of the access. So do you make it available after a year or 6 months, or do you make it available for free? As I said, the NIH guidelines now say after 6 months. And the delay supposedly improves the ability of publishers to make some money off of subscription charges. And that's probably true, although that hasn't been studied extensively yet. I think immediate open access is really the way science should be done. Again, I understand that if we want to allow publishers to make money, we might break the way it should be done. But it seems like the way it should be done is to provide immediate access. Science happens fast. If you don't have access to something published a year ago, you're behind the times. So I think that the gold standard really should be immediate access, and then we can quibble about details. And then there's this third issue of archiving the publications. So there's this thing called PubMed Central, which you may or may not be familiar with, which is run by the National Center for Biotechnology Information. All of the articles in PubMed Central are freely available. That is, you go there, you find an article, you can read it immediately, the full text. There are some rules about what you can do with that archive, so it's not unrestricted use of that archive, but at least everything in there is freely available. And I believe that those archives are fundamentally different than a distributed system where people put up a PDF file on their website, for example. It's just, sure, someone could design a web crawler to find all the papers that are out there and index them. It's a hell of a lot easier to just go to PubMed Central. So I think that the archiving is really important. And it turns out, I didn't understand this at the beginning, but probably the single most important component of gold open access is the license that they use for distributing the information. They use something called a Creative Commons license. I took this from one of my papers published in PLOS, and this is what they put out with the copyright is to me. I get the copyright on the paper. This is an open access article distributed under the terms of the Creative Commons Attribution License, which permits unrestricted use, distribution, and reproduction in any medium, provided the original work is properly cited. So there's an organization called Creative Commons that has created these types of licenses for all sorts of different fields in order to promote the free distribution of information. And if you're interested in this, you can just go to their website, creativecommons.org. They've done this for music, for art, for publications, for all sorts of different things. And what this allows you to do is sort of unlimited. And again, I'll come back to that in 1 minute about the benefits that can come from this. I just want to go through all the different... actually I have a slide here. So, you have no permission required for reuse. You can put the publications in anything. You can even make a book of publications and sell it. That's allowed under the Creative Commons license, even though it's freely available somewhere else. You could sell that book and make a profit if you packaged it in some way, as long as you cited the original source. Related to this Creative Commons sort of license is who gets the copyright. There's sort of a subtle difference between the license and copyright. It's not particularly important for the discussion here, but assigning the copyright to a journal is, when you sign it over, is really unnecessary. And it takes away some of your potential rights and the potential rights of the funder and the community to accessing that information. And all of the gold open access journals give the copyright to the authors. There are some journals that have said, well, we're giving you the copyright now, so we're really open. And what they do is they give people the copyright, and then they make them sign a license over for 99 years for distributing the copyrighted information. So it's not, I mean, you can get the copyright and it's still not completely free, but it's an important component of gold open access. And then there's this issue of who handles the archiving, and I think this is important as well. So it is possible for people to deposit their publication in PubMed Central directly. PubMed Central allows that if you're NIH funded. But few people do this. So there have been surveys that have been conducted. One, I'm not sure exactly when this was conducted, but of the scientists who had the possibility of self-archiving, most of them weren't even aware it was possible. And so the scientists, we're all busy, right? It's much better if the journals where you publish papers just deposit the material in an archive and don't rely upon every separate individual scientist to separately deposit the material. So basically the last thing I want to talk about, which I've already sort of hinted at in this list of the reasons, the things that are gold open access, are the actual benefits of open access. And really, the benefits you can sort of imagine, it's about freeing the literature, and I knew there were going to be students here, so freedom means free means different things to different people. Free beer is one thing, right? Free checking. That's not what open access is really about. It's really about freedom of the publications, releasing them from all restrictions in how they are used, not just making them cheap to acquire. So if you imagine what comes with sort of free access to information, you can imagine all the potential benefits of gold open access publishing. But if you can't imagine that, I'm going to give you an example you might be more familiar with, which is sequence data. So, when people first started sequencing things, they published the sequence in a paper, and there wasn't an archive of those sequences somewhere. Sometimes they didn't even publish the sequence in the paper, they published an analysis of the sequence in the paper, and they didn't release the sequence. And then archives were created. One that you're probably all familiar with is GenBank. So GenBank is a location that now everybody, if you publish a paper analyzing some sequence data, you're supposed to deposit the sequence data in GenBank. Once sequence is in GenBank, it is unrestricted how people use that sequence information. That is, that you can't put it into GenBank and then say, we want someone to ask for permission for analyzing the sequence we put into GenBank. You can repackage GenBank basically however you want. Lots of biotech companies have done this. It's an open archive of sequence information. So I'm going to give you the closed access equivalent of GenBank demonstration here. So let's say you want to go look up a sequence. I know you can't see it there, but that says BRCA1 human that I'm searching for in PubMed. There's the sequence that you get out for the breast cancer 1 gene from humans. That's the entry. You click on the entry to get access to the sequence, and you see you have to pay $29.95 to see the sequence. And this is absurd. It's completely ridiculous. But that's what happens with the publication literature. And in fact, people put more priority on access to data than access to the literature. Yet the currency of science is in the literature, not in the data. It's important to have access to the data to reanalyze things or come up with new findings. But if you can't read the literature that describes how the data was gathered, how other people analyze the data, it's just useless. I mean, imagine having satellite imagery of the Earth for the last 100 years and no information about how those images were collected or how to analyze satellite imagery or how to group them or cluster images. Data is not alone the material of science. The material is in the publications. So I took this even further. Now you pay that $29.95, you get the sequence, and you want to compare it to other things and other sequences, so you go to the BLAST page where you compare sequences. You run your BLAST search, you get the result, and you're told again, if you want to see the other sequence, you have to pay $29.95 to access it. That's what happens when you do a PubMed search right now for literature. It's ridiculous. I mean, just it makes no sense whatsoever in terms of the distribution of scientific knowledge. So now for equivalent benefits. So you can imagine with GenBank, people do all sorts of interesting things with analyzing the GenBank sequences. You can actually do all sorts of interesting things analyzing text in the literature. So there are lots of people, many of them here at Washington, all around the world, who have developed new algorithms for text mining, for scanning literature for information, coalescing it, and trying to learn something from the text. You can cluster papers by similarity of the text in the papers. You can join that with information about the data associated with the papers, and you can try and find patterns in this association. This is just one example of things you can do with text mining. You can look for protein interaction networks by mining the information in publications about describing, say, protein A interacts with protein B. This is a paper by Per Bork and colleagues where they did this. And they pointed out that one of the challenges with doing this, in fact, the most difficult challenge, was the restricted access to the full text information. So by having full text information, they were able to glean information about protein-protein interactions in organisms that had never really been listed in the literature per se, because they had to sum up across a lot of different papers rather than single papers. But again, if they don't have access to the literature, they can't do it. And even if they have access to the literature, so for example, there's something called Texpresso, which is a software and a system for doing this type of text mining. We collaborated with people working on Texpresso when I sequenced the Tetrahymena genome, because we created a Tetrahymena genome database at Stanford by the same people that created the yeast database, the Saccharomyces genome database. And they created a Texpresso run, basically, of clustering of the literature on Tetrahymena. But of course, they couldn't redistribute all of the information from the Texpresso run on the Tetrahymena genome database, because many people didn't have access to the raw literature. So they could run the analysis, make claims about what they found, but people couldn't then mine down into the actual literature that underlied those claims. So another benefit which I am particularly interested in is education. Again, if you have this complete free access to the literature, you can do a lot of things in terms of education. I think, from my point of view, I'm a busy scientist. The most important is, I don't have to talk to any of the lawyers or the copyright people or the, password-protected website designers for making a course website. If I use material that has a Creative Commons license, there are no restrictions in using that information. I don't have to make sure that only UC Davis students have access to that site. I don't have to worry about whether or not we're printing for the course reader copyright-protected material that we didn't get permission for. If you use something that has a Creative Commons license, you have permission to do that already. And it really frees up the ability to do things related to education that is very different than the way we currently operate. I'm not to bash lawyers. I have a lot of friends who are open access lawyers, but as a busy scientist, I know this happens to me all the time. We get emails from the copyright people at Davis telling us once a month about all the problems associated with releasing course information on the web, and why we can't do this, and why we can't do that, and why we might get sued if we do this or that. If you use Creative Commons material, there is no worry. So I don't really have time to go into all of these. These are myths about open access that Biomed Central published. If you're interested, you can go to their website. They go through sort of the... I didn't want to spend all the time talking about all the potential or supposed problems with open access. There are a few, but there are a lot of myths about open access that they detail and debunk basically on their website. I had to put this up because I have the slide on myths, and I wanted to talk about global warming for a second. I view open access to literature in much the same way I view the debate about global change. I think it's very clear rational scientists agree that there is some type of global change going on. It's a debate about what to do about it. I think the same thing is true for open access. I think it's just, it's absolutely the right thing to do for society, for science, for medicine. I think then we can, once we accept that, we can discuss how to do it, what the risks are associated with doing it if they're real, what the challenges are. But we have to start with the premise that access to this information is a good thing. And then it's discussing how to deal with it. And so the future of open access, I really think, is how to deal with the challenges of open access, not whether or not open access is the right thing to do. And of course, one of the problems with open access is that institutions are slow to change. We have a system, I think it's, not the ideal system, but it's certainly not completely broken. Scientific knowledge has progressed pretty darn well with the old system. People don't want to change things. Scientists are really conservative in terms of changing their behavioral patterns. And they claim to be, pursuing, new frontiers all the time, but not in their behavior. And they're not risk takers either, right? So tenure and promotion committees, for example. I'm on many of them at Davis. People talk about where people publish papers, what the impact factor of the journal was, and then they're done with the discussion. They don't talk about the fact that someone might have published, 4 open access papers that were written about in every newspaper in the country, and that they release open source software, and that they're releasing 200 million gigabytes of DNA sequence data. They basically say, do they have, the right number of Nature and Cell and Science publications? It's really hard to change the system. That's worked for them before, apparently. And it's hard to get it to change, but it has to change. It has to change in hiring, it has to change in tenure and promotion committees, and we have to evaluate how people publish things differently. There's lots of talk about this. Open access is a significant component of that discussion. But the big thing that always comes up that is worth talking about right at the end here is how we pay for open access. Because that's the thing that people always ask about. And so, the main way open access is paid for right now is through publication fees. And that is, if you want to publish in an open access journal, you are asked to pay a fee to publish that paper. Some journals, like the PLOS journals, decouple the editorial review from the ability to pay. And if you say you can't pay, they don't make you pay. But other ones don't have the financial wherewithal to do that, so they require you to pay. And this is different than the current mainstream non-open access publishing, where you might actually pay a publication charge in addition to reprint charges, as well as people pay to access the information. The open access model is sort of, so here's a little sort of visual for it. The researcher in the closed access model might pay the publisher, the library might pay the publisher, the reader might pay the publisher, and the funding agencies might pay for subscriptions. Many of the publishers make a lot of money, by the way, but I think that they make money is not a bad thing, actually, but the amount of money going into it is a bad thing. The open access model mostly follows this paradigm, where the researcher or a separate grant pays the publisher to publish things. And then it's freely available. So the publisher is basically a service provider, not a means to make money off those publications. They can still try to make money like Biomed Central does off of something else, much like Google tries to make money off of information. But they're not making money per se off of the openness of the publication itself. And I think that model is perfectly reasonable. It's still unclear exactly how easy it is going to be to switch to that model. I think there's nothing wrong with people pursuing grants to fund open access journals. We get grants to fund databases. We get grants to fund open source software. We get grants to fund open release of strains and culture collections. There's no reason why someone shouldn't get a grant to fund an open access publication. So I think that's coming as well. But the paying for it is still a sort of thorny issue. And then, as I said before, there is this issue with open access to publications and open science. They are not the same thing. They are frequently related, but they're not the same thing. So I think open access to publications is just sort of a no-brainer. Some of the other open science initiatives that have been pushed, I'm still not a complete supporter per se of all of them. So open source software, I support. I think that that's really important. If you get a grant, for example, to develop software, you should try and develop it as an open source software project. Open data release, I think that's really important. I'm for the big projects that are meant to be community resource projects, like genome sequences. I think people should release the data even before they publish on it. I think for individual researchers, there's no reason to force them to release their data before they publish on it. So it's a difference between community resource projects and individual projects. There are those, including many in Congress, who advocate open access to all data all the time. So I'm not a complete fan of that. But there are people who talk about open science where that's what it means to them. That is, you can go read someone's notebook right now, anywhere around the world, everybody doing any science funded by the government. There are people willing to take that risk, and I love that. I love that some people are willing to put their notebooks online, but I still think that should be a choice right now, and not a requirement. We're actually starting to do that with a couple of projects in the lab. Open materials and methods should also be good. I think they're all good things, but they're not the same thing. As I like to say, people have brought this up to me before. I'm really against that open science thing. And well, you can still be against, open notebooks, but support open access to the literature. They're not the same thing. They both can advance science, but I still view them as different things. So the last thing is, what can you do to support open access? Well, you can do what Klaus tried to do at the beginning, which is change the publishing industry. You can, at least if you've never published in an open access journal, you should try it, you'll like it. When I published my first paper in an open access journal, I was stunned by the people in developing countries or reporters who contacted me who were excited, this was early on in the open access movement, excited to read a paper with no restrictions. And I think that that's still true. If you are interested in publishing in open access, you can do what I'm trying to do, which is whenever I have control over publications, I will only publish in open access journals. I refuse to review for, participate in, or do anything for closed access journals. I know I'm crazy, so I don't expect everybody else to do that. But it certainly can't hurt to try to move in a more open access direction. If you're participating in journals, you can either do what some of us have done, which is refuse to participate in the really closed access journals, or you can lobby the borderline ones for change if you are participating in that journal. You can lobby your institution or the government or whomever to support more open access policies. Your institution in particular with hiring and promotion, that's probably the most important thing. And for education, you can use open access material and show how powerful it can be to not have any restrictions in its use. These are just examples of the things you can do to support open access publishing. Or you can get this as your license plate. And I think I will end my talk there.
We have a few minutes for questions, so if anybody has a question?
Yeah.
What happens to the quality of the peer review process under the open access model? And I've also heard of something called open peer review. Can you comment on?
So the question is, what happens to the quality of the peer review process under the open access model? This is one of those sort of, and what was the second part? What is the open peer review? So open access journals have a diversity of peer review policies and systems, just like closed access journals do. So all of the open access journals that I know of have traditional peer review systems. The only exception is PLOS One, which has taken this stand to say we are asking for technical merit only as opposed to novelty or relevance to the journal's goals. But all of the other open access journals have standard peer review systems. The question does relate to the costs of open access journals. So some open access journals can only handle a certain number of papers if they don't have a certain amount of money, right? So money does help support editorial assistants and professional staff members, etc. So PLOS Biology and PLOS Medicine actually have full-time professional staff that aid in the management and review and regulation of the review system. Most of the other open access journals work like society journals, where scientists volunteer their time to do it. Of course, scientists volunteer their time to work for closed access journals, and then they can't even read the papers that they review. So in terms of open peer review, it's a separate topic, right? It's another mechanism. There are closed access journals that do open peer review, and there are open access journals that do open peer review. I'm not sure where I stand on whether or not open peer review is a perfect thing or not. I think it's worth experimenting with. Yeah?
As we wrestle with the business model and how to pay for the editorial costs, not just the publishing cost, but the actual cost of producing a good journal, say a few words about the role of the elephant in the room, which is big pharma. We spend most of our time in these sessions trying to avoid the evil influences of the deep pocket big pharma. Are you worried about that here?
Yeah, so the question is, are we worried about the influence of big pharma in the publishing, which is clearly a worry at a lot of medical communities about their influence on ethics and behavior in other ways. Yeah, a lot of the publishers, the closed access and the open access publishers are worried about that. I don't think it's limited to open access publishers. The societies, for example, have been very worried about this, where they take advertising from, for example. And the page charges that they charge for publishing, if you publish in PNAS, it's listed as an advertisement, right? Because you're paying some fee, and they've decided that if you pay a fee, your publication has to be listed as an advertisement instead of a pure publication. So it's not limited to open access journals, but in terms of, if the financial system is challenged, what do the journals do that don't bring in money from subscriptions or other charges? And it has been discussed. I don't know at exactly what the conclusions are. I think that this is one of the reasons why I support seeking grants to support open access journals, just like you would seek a grant to support an open database or an open cell culture repository or some other open collection of information, in order to try and remove possible conflicts of interest from the funding sources. Yeah.
Related to that, the article that we read in conjunction with your talk talked about the fees that a researcher would pay. Do you have a sense of what is there a consensus about what's a reasonable amount for what you would submit, and how would you deal with that fee if you submit it but you don't get accepted? So we often send our papers around, and now I'm imagining it's costing me $5,000 to finally get mine.
Yeah, most of the journals don't charge for submission. They charge for publication. So that's not as big of an issue, although some have small fees for submission as well. And I personally think that the whole issue of papers getting submitted and then running around to 10 journals or whatever is absurd. And I think we need as a community to come up with a collaborative review system such that if you submit to one journal, you make it easier, even if it's rejected from that journal, to at least be handled by another journal where they send the reviews over, or I think that there are some inefficiencies in the current system. And for example, if you submit something to PLOS journals and it gets rejected by PLOS Biology, which many of my papers get rejected there too, they will transfer the reviews if you want to another PLOS journal. They don't charge you for that. So you get charged if you publish. But how much you charge people for publishing is a really important issue, and it is currently creating some challenges with different fields. So well-funded fields don't have a lot of trouble paying some of the publication charges. Poorly funded fields do. And how we deal with that is unclear in the community. Again, this is why I support grants to try and come up with money to pay for example, open access ecology papers. An ecologist sometimes is lucky to get their summer salary supported and have no money left over for publication charges. So I think it differs among the different fields. But again, the for-profit journals still charge people for page charges, for color figure charges, for reprint charges, for a lot of things. They're not per se free to publish in either. So it's not only an issue for open access journals, it's more of an issue probably for the current model of open access. And I think, this is why I was saying, there are still challenges to how we carry out open access publishing. I don't know the perfect solution to your question.
And I'm afraid we're going to have to draw it to a close. Please join me in thanking